Uh-oh. John, can you hear us? Oh, we can't hear you, maybe.
Yes,
There we
I can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, there we go. Okay, do I, at this time, we'll do the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, do I hear adoption of the agenda?
So moved.
Second.
Been moving second. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Okay, at this time, we will consider the considers and action on the continued discussion regarding the retaining wall guidelines. I guess, would you like to leave this right now, or would Steve, would you like to speak first, or Kim?
Councilmember Lebo has his hand up.
Yes, Councilmember Lebo. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Johnson. As this discussion revolves around retaining walls with a particular interest associated with the Sound Transit project proposed on Bothell Way, and as a Sound Transit employee, while I don't think there's a direct conflict of interest because the work associated with what I do at Sound Transit is unrelated to the STRIDE project that Sound Transit is constructing along Bothell Way, I think it's appropriate that I recuse myself from further discussion regarding this ordinance for retaining walls, as it does directly affect Sound Transit, and I don't wish to become a distraction because there might be an appearance of a conflict of interest given my position with Sound Transit.
Thank you, Councilmember. Appreciate that. Yes.
Council, you had your public hearing last Thursday, and Steve and I decided maybe the best way to get our heads wrapped around everything you heard and to maybe help you do the same thing was to create this chart that's in your packet. Everything on the left side is kind of the main themes we heard last Thursday. And then on the right, information we wanted you to have as you consider this more tonight and going forward, and some ideas of changes or revisions you could make to the draft ordinance. Steve had contacted Pace, an engineering firm that the city uses for peer review, and they gave him information on some of the landscaping, so the guidelines that we had put in. So we've included that information, and really we're here tonight to answer any questions you have in the chart, or really questions that you still have from Thursday night that we didn't address in information in the chart. So.
Any questions for Kim yet? Good. Just seeing none.
Well, could I add, Mr. Mayor, I guess it may be an approach to take would be to just kind of walk through each one of these and see, introduce it, just kind of, why we've added this suggestion, and then see if there's a desire for the council to include something related to that in the next draft. So, and just starting with this was a note on the draft that was reviewed last Thursday, that in order to sort of just clarify, as we did with the town center design guidelines, what does shall mean, what does should mean, and then when you make a policy decision about any of these guidelines, you're clearer, the public's clearer, and the applicant's clear about what that means. So these basically have been incorporated exactly as they are in the town center design guidelines here. And so I guess it'd be great to hear whether council members feel like that would be a good addition to this right-of-way wall design guideline ordinance.
Yes.
I think it is a good addition. I think anything that provides additional clarity, especially to lay people who will be reading this, is important for us and our transparency in government. So I'm behind this change.
Okay.
So yeah, we don't need to spend any more time necessary. So if everybody's generally comfortable with that, can move on to the second and third one are generated in part because of my conversation with the landscape architect at Pace about, I asked him essentially, what do you think about this idea of, first, we had Sound Transit's comments saying that, native may not be the best way for these running vines to be most successful, or those species may not be the most successful. And so that led to further discussions about, well, maybe we should break up that second part of the design guidelines. So if there is a sidewalk, then these guidelines apply. If there's not a sidewalk, as in the case as we understand it, for the wall on the upland side for the Sound Transit project, then we have a separate set of guidelines. So one of the things that the gentleman from Pace also pointed out was, it's really going to be kind of difficult to judge where is the, when you've reached a 30% along any point in the guidelines. And so maybe a better way is to regulate it by the number of plantings per linear, or per foot, so that we give them some incentive to. One thing we talked about was, what if if they put in irrigation along that wall, then they could plant one. I forget what do they call them? These pockets, right? Thank you. They could have a pocket every 10 feet if it's irrigated, but if it's not irrigated, then they would need to be 6 feet on center. And so this is would give you the ability to much easier determine compliance with that planting. So those were numbers that he felt comfortable with, irrigated versus not irrigated. And so what I guess would be great to hear back from you is, do you think the idea of divide, first, do we get rid of, is it okay to delete native, as we said in the last draft? We're suggesting that might be a good thing to do, just to give them more species. And then what about the idea of moving away from the percentage coverage to an incentive-based plantings sequence, or as an alternative way to regulate? Anybody have an issue with removing native?
Oh, thank you very much, Steve, for that explanation and for consulting with Pace. I think both those ideas sound very sensible to me. I really do think that, being a little bit of a gardener myself, that restricting ourselves to native species is really too narrow, and that there are good species that survive well in the Northwest, and particularly as we look at the higher temperatures and the drought that seem to be coming our way, we need to be thinking about the most appropriate species and not just native species. And I like the idea of actually specifying how frequently those plantings are taking place along the corridor. I think that makes a lot of good sense to me.
Okay. Yes, Councilmember.
Thank you. Very similar. I was thinking the same thing, that native is maybe preferred, but then also the criteria of drought resistant, climate resistant, things of that nature to speak to more durable plants, but then where possible shrubs and so forth, if native would work, then that would be preferred. I don't know about this coverage issue, because one of the comments came out, if we spend all this time to develop a facade of the retaining wall that's somewhat beautiful, and then we're just going to grow plants like intentionally all over it. And so where's that balance? I don't know if I have a good direction to give you, but I struggle with asking for a lot of coverage on something that we're asking for a lot of design work to be done to. And my preference is less, generally speaking, less for vines and more for other types of plantings. And I understand in some areas they claim they don't have enough room. But that's just my preference, is less vines, more plants, and more visible artwork.
Deputy Mayor French.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, and first of all, I want to start by saying, Kim and Steve, when I went through this the other day, I think you captured a lot of the things that the policymakers as well as the community were concerned about. So I thank you for that very much. And I think that the question of native versus non-native is kind of, I don't know what the right word is, almost oxymoronic, because if you think about it, native plants were here for thousands of years and retaining walls were not. So putting them on a retaining wall is a little bit problematic as it is anyway. And I think we need to think about what is going to be that has the best success for survival, has the best success for environmental benefits when it comes to reducing dust, sound, pollution, all those factors that the community has illustrated. And I think this bifurcating that, or not bifurcating, but having a surgical approaches, I think is really appropriate. And I think getting away from the specifics of, you know, viney plants also helps. I just have to give a shout out to my Vice Chair Castle that English ivy, I'm still not convinced to be a good solution. So even though it's her fault. So, but thank you. I think also just on point from what Councilmember Riddle said about the question of coverage, I tend to feel like that there does need to be a balance there, because we're covering up sort of, you know, we're asking for the specific kind of texturing or whatever. At the same time, I'm not going to be unhappy if we see a lot more greenery, regardless of what the texture is, just because I think it's going to be better aesthetically for the community in terms of walking and sound and things like that. We've heard it loud and clear from people out there in the media too, as well, that, you know, native plantings might not necessarily work, and there've been a lot of comments online about it. So I think finding the balance there is appropriate, but at the same time, let's find something that's going to survive and make it work.
Yeah, I broadly agree. I think on the question about native, I think native is a good aspirational goal. I quite like the language on the right side that should incorporate plant species native where possible. So that should rather than shall, I think that gets at kind of our goal. And then on the question of coverage, if it's going to be easier, you know, to plan out to say, you know, it seems like it will be, because from the outset, you know, like a vine every X feet, you know how much you need to plant, as opposed to aiming for 30% coverage. So that strikes me as a more objective goal. In terms of coverage overall, I mean, I think what we've heard loud and clear from the community is we don't want gray monoliths. And so whether it is greenery in terms of plants or it's artistic design, I'm happy with either. My preference, I would lean more towards greenery rather than art if we had to choose, but I don't think we necessarily have to choose. So I'm broadly okay with these changes.
Yes, that's my first time.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Director Bennett, for a good summary of this. One thing I was wondering about is, could the texturing and the planting be kind of tied together? Because some texturings will take growing and climbing plantings better than others.
Yeah, I appreciate the question, because I wanted to also bring up another thing that was we discussed with the landscape designer, was that, you know, maybe, you know, the types of vines that are most likely to succeed are also not evergreen. So they could really, in the winter, take away from the designs. I mean, we, you know, have a kind of a combination of an architectural relief as well as planting. So I was thinking of bringing a draft guideline that would say that, you know, that needed to be taken into account, that the plantings, you know, should not, you know, undermine the, you know, the prominence of the architectural design, that they should, you know, that the applicant should consider putting them in spacings that you know, in the winter, it doesn't overwhelm the design. So if there's no objection, we'll bring back a draft guideline like that for you to consider.
Just clarifying question. So you're talking about including seasonality into the mix.
Well, just kind of create a situation where the vegetation and the architectural relief don't compete, and so that, you know, there are some spacing between all the various things we've seen, so that if you've got, the relief of a grove of trees here, that, the vines occur right there, and they can grow without overwhelming or just completely overtaking the vines initially. And so that with maintenance, if you decide that they've gone too far, you can put them back, but not kill them, pull them back.
I'm having deja vu to the town center guidelines.
Yeah.
Same conversation.
Yeah, literally getting into the weeds there.
I think the concept of seasonality is important, and I would like to see language preferring evergreens in here if possible. Simply so that we maintain that color, because the winter is just generally drearier to begin with. And so having deciduous plants won't activate the space as well as a evergreen plant might.
Mhm.
And as I said, I think a preference towards shrubs, trees, and bushes over vines where possible. So anywhere where we do have enough of a planting strip, I think part of the reason is it brings that greenery down to the human scale.
Mhm.
And sometimes when you walk around further up 522 where there is vines, a lot of times the bottom is somewhat empty as they grow up. And so at your human scale, it's not as engaging.
Yeah.
You're kind of in the stem part of the vegetation. So don't know how hard we can push in those directions, but I think as a should,
Mhm.
we should encourage trees, shrubs, and bushes, and we should encourage evergreen plantings.
Right.
And drought
I'm just
resistant
gonna point out,
plants.
should and encourage, don't
Yeah,
mix.
I know.
That's what I'm just saying. You won't find that in the next draft. It's gonna be should or encourage.
So,
Or
should or shall,
preference?
should or shall.
Or should has often, it is not as strong as shall.
Right.
So to me, I think a should, unless my colleagues feel.
Should
strongly that we
encourage, okay.
It should include evergreen, it should, but if they come back and say they can't, then that's where we have the conversation.
Yeah.
But I would like to say shall, but I'm not sure that that's gonna get us very far on this.
Well, on also kind of on your point of having these standards, the way I was kind of envisioning this, if we broke it out, would be if it's a situation where it's back of sidewalk, then we have the standards you're talking about human scale shrubs, et cetera. But if there is no sidewalk, then we have the guideline we were talking about, the standard of plantings every so often. So does that seem reasonable way to approach it?
I would like to see that approach, yeah.
Okay, great. All right, well, if there's not any other thoughts, we could move on to page 2 of this. I don't know if we want to spend too much time on the maintenance on this, because I think there's a question, first of all, about who is maintaining these, and so I think there's still a lot of discussion about and it may be not a great use of time right now until we have that figured out. If the city is going to maintain this, then we don't really need a guideline specifically. We could still have one, but it's not really worth the discussion of should or shall until we have a better feel for whether in general. In most other cases, we're going to have walls. After this first application, we'll have walls that are in city right away. And so it seems like in those cases, there's city projects or the utilities building a wall. It's going to be in the city right away, that the city's probably going to be involved in maintenance of those things. In this case, it might not be. But so I would just suggest we come back to that one once we know more kind of about what the typical situation is going to be. Maybe we can talk internally about that and give you a more enlightened recommendation on that one.
Briefly, I'd like to know the difference between like the 36-month maintenance kind of period and then the maintenance afterwards, kind of like if there's a difference between that as you do your research.
Okay. So the second full box down gets into another recommendation from PACE regarding, how you install these things, and also this is this may be addressed just by how you decide to use should and shall. Because if this is a should, then the vegetation criteria, or if the vegetation criteria changes to what we were talking about, it could be a shell. It's very clear if you're compliant or you're not with the distances. So I don't know that, is there another nuance here you think that we should talk about on this, the box that starts with Sound Transit's comment?
I think Sound Transit's concern is needing some flexibility. If you stick with like 30%, 80%, they don't want to be, stuck to a certain percentage if you end up going that route as it's drafted right now.
And this is also where we noted what PACE's suggestion was in terms of having some language that helps space the vines with and the wall imagery, which we've already kind of talked about. So and maybe what might be a better use of time right now would be talk about, do you want to, we had some comments from the public about why not just have these natural rock looking designs, and so I think early on we talked about that a little bit. I thought the council was very there was a kind of a consensus about the specific Pacific Northwest imagery was important to you all, but if you get into something that's more natural than and like a natural rock, we saw some images of that, that you don't need to so much worry about the design of and plantings conflicting, but we just want to know, just a confirmation, is that still important to the council, just the doing something that speaks to that Pacific Northwest design criteria.
Councilman Earl.
For anyone who hikes or mountain climbs, you'll know that rocks are a critical part of the Pacific Northwest experience. We have, the North Cascades are incredibly craggy and sharp, beautiful mountains. And so to me, that is Pacific Northwest imagery in the most purest form. So to me, I think natural rock looking formations fulfills that same goal. It's not necessarily imagery in art, but it's imagery in imitation.
But if you assume that the applicant kind of goes to the lowest common denominator, once you open that up, you're going to end up with just slightly more than two-dimensional version of that rock. Do you want to open that up as a possibility, or do you because there's a lot of good examples of where we can see imagery that we've seen examples of where that clearly that these are pleasant looking, attractive trees, whereas we've seen a lot of examples of just really formulaic types of rock, and so I guess I see your point. It's like we can get a really three-dimensional look that could be very Pacific Northwest, but I just wonder if knowing kind of where the average applicant goes with something like that,
and depending on the engineering behind it, how
right,
it comes out.
right, yeah, and we've got traffic safety. We don't want these rocks hanging on sides of cars.
Yeah, I've actually been have some fall every now and again. It's super
That would be
realistic.
very natural.
Very, very natural. I would like, I think the images will help with that. So I think I'd like to continue pursuing that and seeing what it looks like in the code.
Deputy Mayor French.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Steve, on point, I think that, I think I heard pretty loud and clear from the council as well as from multiple members of the community that that Northwest aesthetic is really important. We see that all over in new WashDOT projects that are where they're doing new overpasses and things like that. We have stamping of trees, and we saw various examples there. And I think that regardless of what the greenery is that's brought into the mix, I think the nice thing about that imagery is, as we understand it, as lay people in this regard, that's sort of an added benefit. It's not very, very expensive, if at all, when it comes to actual casting of the tilt up walls or whatever form that they're using in terms of structural, integrity for retaining things. And I think from my perspective, I think it's important for us to continue on with that theme. And I think that I'm totally fine with if the greenery covers parts of it. That's okay. I do also think, and a little bit of contrast to my colleague, I think that if it was a natural rock, I'd be happy, I'd be quite fine with it, but that we know is very difficult and very expensive to do. And I think that some of these things look contrived when it comes to trying to imitate that kind of feature, as opposed to something that is not trying to imitate nature, but saying it's artwork, or as one of those tree forms, or one of the salmon forms, or the orca forms, or some of the native art which we've seen, which is really beautiful around our Puget Sound region.
But I think it was kind
All right, yeah, I mean, as I'm looking at some of the pictures in the guidelines, I suppose my feeling is I want it to look natural. And so if you look at figure C in particular, for me, that meets my targets in that there's greenery on it. It's not a monolith. It looks, I don't know how authentic that looks compared to like hiking in the woods, but for me, like if I'm in a car or I'm walking on the sidewalk, that would strike me as something pleasant to walk by. So that sort of rock face, that seems, that seems reasonable to me as the sort of wall that could be designed.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, thank you, Councilmember Goldman, because I also was looking at figure C and thinking that treatment is, reasonable to add. But I didn't want to I wanted to make sure it wasn't the whole thing. Maybe that treatment could be in alternating panels or something, and retain the actual artistic design of that we see in figure A, for example. I don't know if that really works to alternate them, but I don't have an objection to the rock treatment we see in figure C. And I was struck by some of the comments from our community about the fact that some of those walls that have those kind of undulating shapes in them, if you see what I mean, do help with sound mitigation, because it bounces the sound around in different directions rather than reflecting it all back in the one direction when it's a more flat kind of panel. So I think that's something to think about. And I just wonder, what other council members, whether they also were struck by those public comments about how to mitigate the sound. So that's just my thinking on that.
That's about right.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And yeah, I agree with Councilmember Cassover wholeheartedly that in fact, for instance, the figure D is something that I personally I'm not for, especially if it's not going to be an evergreen that we are going to lose the leaves in the winter. And so the point is you'd be left with essentially a geometric kind of shape on a flat concrete wall. So whether it's an alternating pattern or regardless of the design that we end up with, it should be something that looks good both in the winter and the summer. So, my ideal would be to have something like figure A and cunningly plant the green stuff so that it looks like it's basically around the trees and things like that. I don't know if that's possible, but something to think about.
Yes.
Just quickly on point, thank you, Vice Chair Cassover and Councilmember Fertani. I completely agree with you, Philippa, regarding the sound attenuation. I think that in terms of some way of finding some texture there is important. I'm not sure how that necessarily is solved. And I think that I think that from my standpoint, figure it's below, correct? So figure D with the geometric pattern just looks very artificial and contrived to me. It does not seem, it's going to draw your eye to the grid rather than the plants, and aesthetically. And just quickly, I want to, 1,600 some odd feet or more of wall on one part that is a very large swath. And I drove through Mercer Island a couple of days ago, and I was looking at the various situations there. And the reality is there is an opportunity with possibly very little cost to make some real differences here that's aesthetically pleasing to not just the community, but to the people that are, let's face it, the vast majority of the people are moving through here. And I'm hoping that we can find something that is not just, a tunnel, so to speak.
Make one quick statement. During the winter, reaching out as a day, nobody's going to see this. So I'm just wondering, and because to be honest, I'm a lighting guy. I just spent the last 2 weekends doing lighting in my yard and stuff. And we've not talked about accent lighting that shines up, because you're not going to put big street lights, because everybody lives up the hill aren't going to have street lights. That's the darkest road in the city, pretty much. If you drive it at night, I don't know what nobody's talked about, but putting accent lights that kind of light up the wall. Nowadays with a low voltage LED, you can change colors. Like during Ukraine, walls would be yellow and blue. You could do just about anything, but at night it would make it a safer place. It makes something that people go, hey, we drove through Lake Forest Park at night. Yeah, how cool that looks. And it's really not an expensive thing. And all the work you're going to put into designing a wall that looks good, why not see it all the time? So just something to throw out there that we need to talk about. If you like combined, see my yard looks really good, especially at night. Yes, Councilman Bryan.
Thank you. I really appreciate the concept of alternating or creating a variety of types. I think that's a really astute observation, and I'm fully behind some design that would do that. When it comes to acoustics, as I also heard as well, I know that we put in here that it needs to satisfy WashDOT, and I would like us to actually have them tell us how it satisfies the WashDOT. They have to figure it out anyways in order to know that so instead of just the applicant shall document that it satisfies, I want them to document how it satisfies the WashDOT, because I know they've done that. And then I would like to add or exceeds. Let's be honest, we want it to satisfy or exceed the WashDOT requirements. And then to take kind of what Councilmember Cassover was saying, like, let's add some language about reflection and directionality as I don't know how strong a language we can provide, but I was thinking about that it must satisfy or exceed the WashDOT current criteria for noise attenuation as applicable through reflection and absorption techniques, like the use of tilted retaining walls to direct noise upward, large and small variations in the facade to break up the deep to high frequencies, and sound reflection evaluation by an independent testing agency. That could be, there's acoustaticians that can say, yes, this is going to direct the sound up. It may not necessarily need to say this many decibels or we're reducing, but basically saying that this does satisfy directing the sound away from the homes. And I think that that's a reasonable ask to make of Sound Transit. And at that point, that's, I think, kind of the best we can do without going through a full, have them testing in the field and so forth, which I don't think is where we want them spending their money. We want them spending their money on designing a beautiful wall.
So the language that you just did, that would be in addition to the WashDOT standards?
I just suggested more ways that they could do it. I haven't delved specifically into the WashDOT standards, but more it was giving them a suggestion, a strong suggestion of not simply not creating more noise, but actually solving some noise problems, which I don't think the WashDOT standard is really about solving noise, but it's about containing it and making sure it's at not too high levels and decibels, as I understand it. Like I said, I haven't delved deep into the WashDOT. So I would like to know if that kind of language would work, it would fly, it would be something we can ask them to use those sorts of techniques.
I think that, I mean, when we look at the authority that WashDOT is given over these walls on state highways, it's very clear they have all authority over design. So anything you add, I think WashDOT will say, you do not have authority to do that. We have full authority over wall design. So I would keep that in mind as you add on to WashDOT standards. I also heard you say encourage, or, you know, you would like them to look at this, or this is another way they could show the city they had done that. But I think that's what you're up against when you add this language and other things, anything to the wall design actually, is you're up against that authority of WashDOT of full control.
Yeah, ideally, I would love to see an engineering system that has a slight layback, that has the rock-like face that will look aesthetic. The plants will look more natural on it, and you're driving that sound upward rather than, you know, towards the houses. Again, we can't demand that because of what you're saying, but I would like to drive them in that direction as best as we can to let them know that's what we would find the most acceptable, or whatever the council determines is. I think we want to be clear, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Of what the aspiration is, yeah. It looked like you might have that written out quite nicely. Would you mind sending that to me?
Absolutely, it will be in your
I
inbox.
couldn't write that fast.
No, don't worry, I got it noted.
Deputy Mayor French.
Thank you, Ms. Dora. Just quickly on point relative to the question of this this ordinance. Just a reminder to colleagues, the lens that we're looking at this through is that this is right of ways. And so this is also going to impact the roundabout project and other things as well. So it's very important for us to be very, very clear that this is, it's generic. We're talking about right of ways, retaining walls within those right of ways, and ensure that we're considering all potential considerations regarding that. And I know we can't foresee every circumstance, but I mean, the roundabout is, as Mr. Director Perigo said, is going to be on our radar very, very shortly here. And that is something to be considered. There will be retaining walls. There will also be additional places that we may need retaining walls on 104 and other locations going due to culverts and other various things, as well as places we're not really aware of. So I just want to make sure we bracket this and keep, or not bracket it and keep it broader.
Yes, Councilmember Freeman.
On point then, thank you, Deputy Mayor French, and thank you, Councilmember Riddle, for that language. Should that be in the intent? Because I noticed the intent doesn't address anything at all about noise, so that might be a really good place to encourage people to think about those things.
I prefer. Guess when you're ready, we could move on, Steve.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. Moving on to page 3, the first two items seem like they're pretty straightforward in terms of we can beef up some language that would require structural review and make the treatment necessary to reduce the likelihood that graffiti becomes permanent. Is there any objection just to go ahead and dialing those up the way I'm describing it? And the wall will also require a building permit, so it will get structural review and through that process, as well as WashDOT's approval. So we'll go ahead and include that language. So the third row is probably worth some discussion. The comments were, and just, to characterize them, were like, should this be a decision that rests with just the Public Works Director, or should there be, potentially a design review board to do this? One, sort of kind of looking at these things as the two ends of a spectrum. One thing that we were thinking about was, what if the Public Works Director was required to get a peer review by a designer, So it's sort of like it'd be kind of an administrative, second opinion on their on the design that they could, that we could kind of codify into the process. Because and I don't know if this comes up again at the design review board or
Later in there.
later. Okay, so we may want to talk about these all together when we get to the section about design review board. Where's that? Okay, well, these are of course all the options under the last row, starting on page 3, going on to 4. So I'd suggest we come back to that when we get to that last issue. That's really the biggest issue in here is notice and who is the reviewing body. So and then I've got comments about define regular maintenance, specify when plants fail, require irrigation. As we discussed, I think that we can probably find either an incentive to require. I mean, if you want to go this route, you need to irrigate it, and I'd like to get a little bit more input from our consulting landscape designer about that. But we can't really force. We can't make other agencies bond for these types of performance standards. So I think we also, City Attorney Pratt and I need to think about, what, and give you a recommendation on, do we just have a maintenance plan, and how do we enforce that? If another agency is tasked with the maintenance, would be better off just making sure the city is, the design meets our standards, and then we take on the maintenance, make sure it works for us, or we get some sort of compensation from the applicant to pay for that maintenance for the 3-year or 5-year period, whatever it is. So, but any thoughts about that? We touched on it a little bit about maintenance in general.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Colleagues, if I may, I think it might be helpful, and forgive me if it's not helpful or you're already versed in this, for Cameron Steve to give us a brief one-on-one overview of the types of decisions that are in the past that are available. So that are in chapter 1626. Would you mind doing that in 30 seconds or what?
Stopwatch.
Okay.
You have ministerial decisions. That's the lowest level of decision. There's very little public notice or noticing. It's might be posted and on the site, and the decision is made by the director. Then you've got type 1, actually. All right, type 3 is the director with the most public input. You've got notice mailed out 300 feet, a comment period for 14 days, and then the director makes the decision. It is appealable to the hearing examiner. And I had the code pulled up because just a second here. I'm going beyond my 30 seconds. So type 2 is the hearing examiner. He'll do open record public hearing before he makes the decision. So you have public testimony, applicant testimony, staff testimony at that hearing before the hearing examiner. The hearing examiner would be making the decision based on the code. So based on the design guidelines that are put in place by the city council. Type 3 is the code administrator. the director makes that decision after giving public notice, but there is no public hearing. It is also appealable to the hearing examiner. And then type 4 are city council legislative decisions for non-project actions, which is what you're going through right here. We just call them type 4, but it's a council's legislation.
Thank you very much. I hope that's helpful. The question came up from a colleague earlier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, and thank you very much, Kim, for reminding us how all those work. So I'm having a little bit of confusion here about the sort of intersection of that overall control that you talked about, the Washington State Department of Transportation having over the walls, and some of the things that we're talking about now. So if the Washington State Department of Transportation has control over the walls, what you're talking about here is not the walls then, but the right-of-way stuff? Could you just clarify that?
I actually think that this ordinance is attempting to add some things that don't conflict with WashDOT's authority. That was, I would say, Steve and I's intent when this first came to you in January, was trying to add some things that we didn't think WashDOT would mind. They weren't competing with or in conflict with WashDOT's authority, what WashDOT had on the books. The further we go, the more difficult that becomes to say it isn't in conflict.
From my David Lynch quote.
Okay, so I mean, so it's just hard for me to imagine here if the Washington State Department of Transportation has authority. What authority does the hearing examiner have? I mean, they can't force WashDOT to do anything.
No, they can't. No, the hearing examiner will only be able to look at the code sections you have passed. So everything in 1250, if you pass that, that is the only thing the hearing examiner will look at. WashDOT or Sound Transit will look at this way before then and could choose to file with the Growth Management Hearings Board saying the city has exceeded their authority.
In how we've written our ordinance.
Yes.
I see. So that's not up to the hearing examiner.
No.
To make that determination. That helps.
There, sorry. Yes, I should have clarified that.
Yes. Mayor Trent.
Yeah, just one more quick comment, and I was gonna come back to this later, but since we're talking about authority, the question of maintenance, of course, this is coming up in the news all the time because of the situation with 520. And the maintenance relative to the various lids that are being incorporated, that have been incorporated and been maintained for a period of time by WashDOT, as well as, I guess, sort of tangentially by some of the cities. I'm not quite sure how it worked, but now WashDOT is saying we're not going to maintain them anymore. Do we have the authority to write into the code to say we have expectations about relative to maintenance, or do we not necessarily have that?
First, I would say there is a chart that describes how large a city it is, the type of state highway it is, and who has the obligations to do different things and maintain different things on that state highway. I have not memorized that chart.
I think the threshold's 20,000, I believe, if I recall correctly.
So, but I can't remember where this wall would come in. I know that administration, Phil, and I'm not sure if Steve has been on this, have been working on those things very closely with WashDOT and Sound Transit. And I don't know where those discussions have gone or who has agreed to do what based on this chart. So I don't know what has happened so far. And Phil is off the hook tonight, so.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you for summarizing the different types of decisions. I think where I'm at, I like the type 3 decision. I think something we've heard from the community is they want to be involved in this process. They want there to be an open hearing about it. And I think that the type 3 decision, I think that does have an open process. People near where the wall will be built will be directly notified. It'll be posted for everyone in the public, because while the retaining wall might be built locally in one part of the city, it really affects everybody who's going to be driving or walking along the way for this particular project. So yeah, I'm supportive of saying that this would be a type 3 decision.
Councilmember Riddle.
I agree. I had a quick question. Can we as a city notice beyond the 300 feet, or is that somehow conflicting with
No,
their-
you
their
could,
rights?
you could, I think Steve and I were,
It's a minimum.
Yeah.
At least people with 300 feet try to usually go beyond that.
Can with the type 3 ask them to notice to all of Lake Forest Park, or would they do the 300 and then it's up to us if we want more people to know? I'm just curious how that
Well,
works.
you put that in the town center design guidelines.
Okay, so we can
or-
just do the same thing, a type
You
3
could.
with noticing the,
There's a, a fairly large expense associated with that. So, I mean, I guess.
we're a
I
small
would think,
city.
I would think you'd want to, see where the other council members are at.
Yeah,
A point of information, who bears that expense of that meal?
Well, I mean, you could say that the applicant has to do it, but I don't know if that's really somewhere we want to go with the public applicant.
we do know cost is a factor with essential public facilities, so.
So. We can
The-
ask the applicant to bear the cost, is that what you're saying?
You can, I would consider it as one of the factors. It's a cost.
Yeah.
And how much of a cost is that? And does it play into precluding an essential public facility? Like ST3.
I think if that's what stops, then I think we're in trouble. Okay,
I think the last time we were at the Growth Management Hearing Board with Sound Transit, we were told this was a death by 1,000 cuts. I clearly remember that phrase. Sure, we'll hear it again.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. And
before.
thanks for the clarification, Attorney Pratt. And one question I had was, so the design review board at the very bottom of that page that might be instituted, is that, so that's a type 4 kind of legislative decision making. Does that conflict with agreeing that the type 3 is a good one too, or are they independent?
No, it would be different than the type 3 so instead of the director making the decision after receiving public input through public comment, this would instead have the design review board make the decision. The design review board was created when council adopted the new town center code. So my thought was, if you were going to use a citizen group to make this decision, one place you could look was to kind of tweak the design review board a little bit, just so we weren't starting all over and creating another board in the code. So that was just a thought to give you. You could play with them and then they would make the final decision. It would be more like the hearing examiner making that decision. You could say they hold a public hearing or not. There's new legislation that's only saying one hearing, one public meeting on these types of decisions. So you should be careful in making that decision.
Okay, thank you. And so just to clarify then for myself as well as for everyone at home, then the type 4 would be the design review board choice. The type 3 would be the comment period without the public hearing, and then the appeal to the hearing examiner. And then the type 2 would be having a public hearing, but the examiner makes the decision.
The only thing that I don't think you're correct on is calling the design review board a type 4.
Okay,
And I see why you're saying that because of something else I put in here. Type 4 is council only. And it's just passing code. It doesn't have anything to do with making the decisions after you pass the code. So really, using the design review board is more like, it would be more like having the hearing examiner do it.
Great, thank you for the clarification.
Or you could also put the design review board in the position of the director and not holding a public hearing and accepting public testimony, but just accepting public comments after notice to everyone.
Deputy Mayor French.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just on point, again, the question of the design review board, revisiting this from the town center guidelines. Were there comments from our friends at Sound Transit regarding concerns of the design review board when it came to?
No, but it was not in the draft and they were commenting on the draft.
That's right, they were, okay, thank you for the clarification.
So another thing is making this kind of number of, I would say, substantive changes to the draft. You'll want to hold another public hearing so that people can comment on the new.
I see. Okay. With your thought, thank you.
Okay, Steve, remember.
Just a clarification on a thought. So we can utilize some sort of design review process to either advise the director or to act as the director in a type 3,
Kind of creating your own thing.
3.5.
There you go. There you go.
But if we stuck to a very clean type 3, we can still create an internal process to help the director make his decision. Is that correct? Like having an art review group that can make recommendations or make comment. That's sort of outside of this, the type 3. That's our internal process that we can create.
You could create that and you could put it in code, but there was going to be a art council that would provide recommendations during the public comment period to the director.
Okay.
The kind of the issue, I think, with looking at the design guidelines, keep in mind the design guidelines are supposed to be written such that it's kind of a, it should be, an applicant should know when they file their application if they match the design guidelines. This shouldn't be going into a hearing and having people kind of say, oh, I don't think that, I don't like that, I'm not getting a fuzzy feeling from this. And so you're the most of the work, and I know this isn't popular, should be in those design guidelines. What do you want? And then after that, it shouldn't be as hard to have that final decision made because all the work was done when you put it into those design guidelines, like you did with the town center. That was blood, sweat, and tears over those. My tears.
Yeah.
Yes. Remind me, can we put nots in the, like, do not do this in the design guidelines? Is that also an option? So like,
Yeah,
do not
sure.
provide flat blank wall, like, that's something we
Yeah, I
can't
think
do.
that's kind of common. No
this,
flat
no
blank walls.
Sure, yeah. There's a lot of design guidelines like that.
Yeah, or in the case of the, the pattern that is just the grid pattern, like no.
But if you tell them it has to be something Pacific Northwest, like A, B, or C, I don't think you also have to say no grid patterns. Because that's not even close.
Yeah,
You could.
and I guess for my colleagues as well, I think the one thing that I'm struggling with here is, are we okay if it's just stamped concrete with, Pacific Northwest imagery? Are we okay if it's all looks like native rock with vines? Are we, I think we need to get better understanding of what our intent is. And then be able to refine these design guidelines to be more in that. I'm not sure that this is the right venue, but I feel like we're not in agreement quite yet. We're close. But I also don't think the design guidelines as written are doing what we want it to do.
Deputy Mayor French.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm struggling with this right now, partially because I'm getting some refreshed on some information and some new information as well. My strong lean is towards having a opportunity for public input beyond just a hearing. I'm concerned about the legal ramifications of, the question of what that input looks like in terms of design review board and ensuring that things don't become arbitrary and capricious, so to speak, using quotes within the and also, looking at the Anderson versus Issaquah. I remember reading that during the town center guidelines discussions, and I want to make sure that whatever we do, so I'm leaning sort of between 3 and I don't know exactly how to describe the other option, but again, heavy on the public component here. But I personally need to do some additional homework when it comes to legal ramifications of this, and I may need to reach out to you, Kim, as well.
Sure.
For a couple of clarifications, because we started the town center process almost 6 years ago. Some of my recollection, it's either selective amnesia or it's just getting fuzzy. I'm not sure what you.
Okay. Moving on, council. Okay.
Well, I think those were the main issues. The last few items are just items that we didn't really come up with a potential code amendment potential. Anything, City Attorney Pratt, you want to add regarding those last 2 or 3 items? Or?
I think these were concerns we heard from more than one, more than one member of the public at the public hearing, but not necessarily anything I thought could be addressed in amending a retaining wall ordinance. But I guess I wanted people to be aware. We did hear this concern. This just isn't the place to fix it.
Councilman
That's
Brito.
just me.
Quick question about, in town center, we referenced sort of a safety guidelines for design that involved lighting and so forth, other things. We were working, I think, with the chief on what that meant. Is this an area where we can reference those same sort of guidelines as far as lighting and safety and things of that nature? If you recall what I'm saying, I can't remember
I
the
do.
acronym.
I do. It's kind of a crime prevention type of, that's what they are. I don't remember the name of them. Do you, Steve?
Oh, yeah, I know what you're, it's another acronym that's
Yeah.
escaping me, but
I don't-
there's so many safety type of things that go into the facility in a right of way. That's driven through the county road standards and state criteria as well. I wonder, if we're talking about a situation with a sidewalk, then there are clearly some, pedestrian things that need to be done to make it safe for pedestrians. In a situation where you don't have a sidewalk, that this is just wall and then travel lane, is it, I don't know that it's really worth it to get into a lot of those crime prevention type things when it's just going to be vehicles for the most part. I think we could look at whether, there's some lighting parameters that are already part of the county road standards or that Public Works is following, and then get back to you on that.
That would be great, especially for those pedestrian areas. I
Yeah,
understand that
right.
perhaps the less pedestrian ones, we don't need to be so concerned, but
Mhm.
I'd like to see what's in the existing standards and see if
Sure.
that acronym, I can't remember, is
Mhm.
better.
And by the time we get back, we'll remember that. acronym.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. And so Attorney Pratt, one of our correspondents wrote that we should not be timid in terms of overstepping in some respect on this, and that the growth board or some other board will have jurisdiction, will say so and life will go on. But there are actually costs to the city if something like that happens, right?
Yes, I mean, the litigation fees will be quite large. And so that is not, it's up to council, but that is not a cost I would minimize. And, you know, cities have reputations before the growth board. And if, so they say they don't take that into consideration, but that is not my experience in front of the growth board. So I would disagree with that comment. Respectfully disagree with that comment.
I think that really needs to be made clear to a lot of people. And can I continue? One other thing, the city has already had a brush with such a event with the Burt Gilman Trail expansion, correct?
Burt Gilman Trail expansion, and then with the town center regulations as well, we were brought in front of the growth board.
Okay, so you might say that our reputation precedes us.
Yes, I think for the town center regulations, there was not an actual hearing on the merits. We did settle that case with Sound Transit. So I don't think the growth board, you know, probably made a decision one way or the other on LFP's, you know, how we deal with the guidelines. So I think you're okay there.
Thank you.
But Mr. Curtoni covered exactly what I was going to say. Thank you. It's, the history is important to remember, and it can be very expensive. And so I think it's really incumbent on all of us to think about, as we were having the conversation with the community, trying to really find what that fine line is about making sure that the community's wishes are adhered to, but not stepping over it into a place where we've exceeded our statutory authority and get into a place where we're in conflict with the board.
Councilmember Goldman.
Yes, so another concern I have related to what I've heard from the public is they want to make sure, you know, they kind of, I heard a number of them say to slow the process down. And I was hoping I could get your take on timing, because a fear that I have is if we keep this deliberation process going for too long, Sound Transit, we're expecting 90% design from them next month. And at that point, they may start submitting permit applications. And so what are your thoughts on when we really should have these retaining wall guidelines approved?
Slowing this process down in itself, I don't think gives the city any advantage at all. You want these guidelines in place and to apply to any retaining walls that are applied for in the near future. And so slowing it down. What I also heard people when they said slow this down, I think some of them were saying, you know, look at this very seriously. Don't jump to, you know, a decision unnecessarily, really focus and take this deliberately. Of course you will. But to just slow down, thinking that will help us in any way with the Sound Transit permit is misguided.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I think we've gotten through the list of the comment summary of comments and our suggestions. And so we had talked about what the next opportunity to come back to council is on this one. So I'm not sure that we can be ready for the committee of the whole on this, but we did want to talk with you about the tree, the right-of-way tree regulation code update that on the if that's a possibility on the next Monday.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you very much, Steve. So I completely agree. I think that this would be way too much for, and you folks deserve a life over the weekend. Yeah, we can for Monday, then we can consider the right-of-way tree ordinance, as well as continue and wrap up our discussion of the governance manual. And then just a reminder, colleagues, we do not have a Monday in June for a committee of the whole meeting, so we will have to schedule an additional special meeting so we can continue discussion, things going ahead at pace. And we'll need to take a look at a calendar here. I will do it tomorrow. In conjunction with the administration, we'll figure out something that will work for everybody, and I'm hoping we can get something set up in the next 2 weeks. If I may, is it okay to ask what people's preferences are? Are people going to be out of town? If we're really in town next couple weeks? Yeah, I will be gone from the. So that.
Not in the tenants. I'm gonna be gone from the 9th to, I think, the 19th.
Okay.
This is like doing math on TV. We shouldn't do it, but I'm gonna do it anyway. How is June 5th looking? It's on Monday that mercifully my calendar is nothing on. And I also want to be sensitive to staff's time because
I don't have any conflicts. I could make that work if it works with council and staff.
Mr. Lebo, Monday, June 5th. Council special meeting to continue. Okay, got thumbs up from everybody. Okay, is that what we feel?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
That it then?
Did we have?
It is.
Yes.
You know, just, I know it's our job here to give some guidance to staff, and I feel like we're sort of a lot of loose ends. And so I just want to kind of wrap up a little bit in my own mind, just so that I'm clear and just see where staff, other council members are on some of these important issues. So I am concerned that we are careful here to keep the boundaries clear between what is appropriate for us as a city to be legislating versus what the authority is with the Washington Department of Transportation. And the reason I say that is that actually we are relying on the good graces of the Department of Transportation for some of the things we're asking for here. And so for us to go too far could really damage some of the negotiations that are taking place by our staff with Washington State Department of Transportation. So I just want to put that caution out there, and thank you to the staff who have been doing those negotiations, and I know they've been going pretty well. So that's in my mind. The other thing that is a sort of bit of a loose end, and Councilmember Riddle referred to it, is what we as a council really want in terms of the design of this wall. And I would say that what I think I'm hearing from my council member colleagues here is that we want some variety, that we don't want the same design for the whole wall. We don't want flat surfaces, you know, with no design on, and that we're okay with a mixture of artistic design and that natural rock face. And that how we sort of mix that up is probably going to be a little complicated, but that I think that can be done. And I don't know if we have to write it in very clearly in the guidelines or not, but that to just simply say that some variety between artistic design and the natural rock look is appropriate and acceptable to us as a city. And that the plantings can be, you know, appropriately placed between those two types of wall face. And then when it comes to this type 3, type 4, you know, design guideline review board, I appreciate the idea of including a design review board here. I'm looking for some guidance, I think, from the city attorney as to whether that, and our staff as well, as to whether that, how that will be perceived by the Washington State Department of Transportation, whether that's pushing the boundaries a little too far or whether that's going to work. So I'm interested in that aspect of this, as well as because I want to satisfy the community, but I don't want for us to sabotage our own position here with people who have authority that we don't have. So that's my concern about that. So I'm actually quite satisfied with the type 3 decision, because I think that allows enough public input and gives the hearing examiner the opportunity to carefully review whether the design meets the standards that we have put into our code, which hopefully we have already negotiated with WashDOT and Sound Transit is acceptable to them. Does that all make sense?
Sure.
You're here.
Okay, so that's kind of where I'm coming from, and I hope that gives you some guidance, Steve and Kim, and I wonder whether my colleagues have any sort of concerns about what I've just articulated or anything to add.
Yes.
Just a quick thought. I think those are very insightful comments, Philip. I really appreciate your summary there, and I'm really thinking about that line of community input right up to the point where we don't step over the line. And to wit, the history in our community of 522, for example, is a little bit sordid, because the redevelopment of the southern section down to 145th was affected in the 90s, and the community didn't have input on that, and we ended up with telephone poles in the middle of sidewalks and ADA, massive issues with ADA compliance, and all sorts of questions about why were they allowed to do these kinds of things. It was just a blight when it was first put in place. And when the calls started coming in, I remember talking to the then mayor, that the people were saying, I literally cannot navigate down the sidewalk because of the way it was designed. The second project too was the expansion of 522, 11 feet or 12 feet ostensibly over the Berkeley Trail. And that at that time, that was in the mid-90s, if I recall correctly. Similarly, it was a situation where then we had people who were riding the trail saying, why was WashDOT allowed to expand and put these massive walls right next to our beautiful green space that we had along the trail, and they lost, and so many trees were lost during that project. And so I think I'm just saying those, refreshing my memory and everyone else's memory, because I think the pendulum swung the other way to a place where the community continues to want to say, we need to have this input and we don't want to go back to that place. And I think unfortunately 522 has its history that and that we need to make sure that we don't repeat our mistakes as a community. So that's one of the lenses that I'm looking at from the community. And I'm going to dig deep for my own personal edification to make sure that I understand better what the ramifications of are going to that line. I believe very deeply that we need to have as much community input as we possibly can without going into the arbitrary and capricious area or danger of going in that area, which means that potentially, to your point, Philippa, we could get nothing that we're looking for.
Yes.
Yes.
So I just want to make sure everybody understands. So a type 3, the administrator makes the decision after sending out public notice and getting back public comment. Type 1, the hearing examiner makes the decision after same notice, public comment, and a public hearing. I did not, I put type 3, we put type 3 in the chart.
It's an appeal to hearing examiner.
Appeal to hearing examiner. I just want to make sure, yes.
Okay, so maybe, so in a type 1, does the mailing happen and all of that then?
Yes.
Oh, okay, so the type 1,
Mailing goes out, you could make it more than 300 feet, which I heard.
right,
Then the administrator gets 14 days of public comments. Administrator makes the decision. That decision gets sent out to people who've made comments. And then any appeal is to the hearing examiner. that appeal has a hearing.
What you just said sounded more like type 3.
It is. I'm sorry. When you were going through it, Philippa, you said the hearing examiner make the decision. And so I thought you might be referring to type 1, and I wanted to make sure I understood which one you were in favor of. And it sounds like type 3 because you're satisfied if there's an appeal to the hearing examiner.
Yes,
Thank you.
yes.
Thank you.
And to clarify, we can set up an internal process to assist the director make a decision if that's working within that type 3. Because that's sort of outside of the applicant's experience and role in that process. Is that not a 100% true statement?
You could choose to have a body you create, give the director a recommendation. The applicant will be very, it's not outside. They will be very interested in who's on that body and when they give the recommendation, and because they're looking for those types of things. So they will be very interested in who that body is going to be, how long it's going to take, those kind of things.
And that one, remind me again, does have a public hearing or just public meeting? What can we, does type 3 come with a public hearing?
No,
No, but if we wanted to have a public meeting to hear the community's input, that would be something that Washed Up and Soundtrack would be interested in knowing what's happening, but would that be stepping over a line? And you don't have to answer, but I'm kind of thinking about how do we take a type 3 and make it a little bit more inclusive to our community in a way that, again, doesn't step over the boundaries. And
I think usually the way we get that normal process, general course, public comments. And that's written. The notice is sent out. Please give us your comments on this project. And people send in written comments.
Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Kim, I'm going to channel you here for a second. Either way, there's an appeal to the hearing examiner. And regardless of either path, the hearing examiner, the lens that he's going to look at through his decision is going to be what the code says specifically.
Yes.
So comes full circle back to
us.
There you go.
One further clarification on the clarification. So the body that Summer proposes, which is outside of the code that we're writing, it can't be called the design review board because that would be considered part of the process that we've outlined.
Well, we have a design review board already. And so if you don't want them to do what, the design review board is set up to do already or something very similar, I would not, choose them as the avenue. I would make up something else and, you'll have to appoint people. Are their meetings going to be open record, all that kind of stuff? When do they give their recommendation?
So could we call them an advisory, a public works advisory group or something?
Yeah, yes. And I apologize for using your first name earlier, Councilmember Castle.
That's all right. I used yours.
So we're gonna call it Friends of Jeff. And Councilmember Goldman, Councilmember.
Yeah, so on the topic of a design review board or whatever name we would give to it, I think this is something that Deputy Mayor French had said. I would be very interested in knowing the legal ramifications because I would be concerned if an applicant felt that they were kind of blindsided, that they thought they were following the code. And then all of a sudden an advisory group kind of gave a bunch of other recommendations that mean that they have to go back to scratch, back to the drawing board. And so I would want to know, like, do we need to set boundaries on what this design review board can see? Do we have to set boundaries on what they're allowed to suggest, what they're not allowed to suggest? But yeah, I need to know more about that as an option.
You would, yeah, you would necessarily be telling them that they have to base their recommendation on the code you adopt, which is going to include guidelines or standards on design. So they're going to necessarily have to base their recommendation on that. You're going to tell them that, whether they do it or not. I don't know. And it certainly does open up an avenue for a disgruntled applicant to have another avenue for appeal. You know, it's all based on, you know, this small group who doesn't like our project and they didn't base it on the guidelines. And, you know, people don't intentionally, you know, say things that are outside the guidelines, but they're very passionate about it. And, you know, it just, that it's a possibility that definitely adds another alternative of appeal for an applicant.
What, can I ask you a question? So if we had an advisory group, would they be able, for example, to decide how many panels of aspen trees versus pine trees versus rock wall are going to go along the corridor, that kind of level of advice to the applicant or to the public works director?
They would have to find that the guidelines give them the ability to do that. So you would, your guidelines would set that criteria that, you know, it needs to be buried in this manner. So if we can't give them that specificity, then they're kind of getting out of bounds of what City Attorney Pratt's saying.
Okay, that was what I really wanted to know. Would we have to get down to that level of specificity for them to be able to make that kind of recommendation?
I think you.
So,
Yeah.
so I think, you know, so as we continue to talk about this, I have to say to my colleagues, I don't know that having a citizen advisory group or design review board is actually going to help us, because there's very little they're actually going to be able to do. All they can do is to say whether or not the applicant has met the code guideline, you know, met the outlines of the code, right? They are not going to be able to add anything. They're not going to be able to change anything. They're not going to be able to say we don't like aspen trees, we prefer pine trees. I mean, they just are not going to be able to do any of that. So, so I worry about raising the expectations of the public around what such a body could in fact do. So I'm being cautious here, you guys, and it's a little bit antithetical to my normal sort of personality, but when we're dealing with legal issues and with the costs of fighting them, if they get to that place, I think we have to be responsible.
Okay. I'd like to say one thing on that. You know, guys, you all ran for office and people elected you by a majority trusting you to make these type of decisions. And I'm quite confident you all got elected because you're very smart and that's why you got elected. So those are decisions that you're elected to make at this. So it's quite right. We don't need to. These are the things that you guys are up here for. So we need to do that and move forward. And your guys' job is make sure we have the wall that we're left with, that every other city wants to have a wall like. We need to be on the page. We want these walls, not the page where we don't want these walls. Let's make that handle. Okay, before we get out of here, I would love to be a little person on John's shoulder because he's probably wanted to say something all night. Would you like to just say one quick thing like, hello, John, or have a nice evening, or?
Thank you for that opportunity, Mayor Johnson. I'm always impressed with the deliberation and thoughtfulness of the council members. And yeah, it's always a pleasure to watch you guys work. I wish I were there on the same side as you are.
I wish you were there too. Thank you. Okay, anybody else, council?
Just thank you, council, for this
Thank-
discussion.
Yes. thank you. Very
Absolutely.
good.
Thank you, staff, and for listening to us and coming back with all the requests. I appreciate it wholeheartedly.
Thank you. Thank you, council. Have a great evening.